people.
Yes.
Exceptional, Carla. Thank you for that
Oh, thank you.
prompting. Carla, a few more participants and attendees are arriving. I suggest that we wait just a few more minutes before we begin.
Okay.
Maybe not minutes, but moments.
Minutes a long time, Russ.
It is. That's a long time. Numbers are looking really good, Carla and Helen. So I suggest that we're ready to begin.
Okay, thanks so much, Russ. Hello, and welcome to the Federal Government Distance Learning Association's webinar series. I'm Carla Lane, FGDLA's Vice President for the Higher Education sector and a moderator for today's webinar. FGDLA is a nonprofit professional association formed to promote the development and application of distance learning in the federal government. We actively foster collaboration and understanding among those involved in leveraging technology and instructional media in support of the education and training needs of the federal government. FGDLA is a chapter of the United States Distance Learning Association. Our membership is derived primarily from individuals employed by the agencies within the federal government. We invite you to join with us in this exciting field. Our web address is fgdla.us. This is the fourth in a series of 7 new webinars, and we hope to add more. To give you a taste of what we have planned, our next webinar is on May 26th and features Dr. Jonathan Peters of Sententia. He specializes in developing gaming for training and education. The 6th webinar is on June 23rd with Diamond Systems, a firm that specializes in instructional design and development. On July 21st, Kelly Barnett will present on the SHOTS micro-learning videos that he developed for the IRS. All of the sessions are at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We are so proud that Zoom is the sponsor of FGDLA and has been instrumental in helping us present the webinars. We'd like to thank Zoom and Russ Colbert for sponsoring today's seminar. Zoom and Russ are the best sponsor and partner that FGDLA could have to advance distance learning. Thank you so much.
Carla, you are so welcome for that. It's a pleasure to serve you and the members of the federal government DLA. I would like to thank all of you and especially my coworkers that are on the call with us today from Zoom and my coworkers that I work with every day at the federal government DLA, and also for my assigned customers, especially one that I think is so amazing with accessibility features is the United Nations. And on the call with us today is UNICEF, an amazing customer with great applications. So thank all of you for being with us and being my friends. I would like to just cover a couple housekeeping items, Carla. One is, you can imagine this is an accessibility webinar. So we have activated live transcription. You can see that at the bottom of your screen. If you choose to show it, you can through your in-meeting controls, or you can hide the live transcription if you choose to do that. I love this feature because it's voice to text, and it really is just to me flipping a switch, so to speak, to activate this as the host of a meeting or a webinar. I really love it. Also, attendees can choose to self-select how you view the panelist in this webinar by using either speaker view or gallery view in the upper right-hand corner of your screens. And also, the last item is everyone on the webinar today, whether you're a panelist or an attendee or a host, can please, if you would, use the question and the answer feature for any questions or any comments that you might have. Carla, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Russ. The topic today is accessibility and Section 508. Our expert is Helen Chamberlain, who is the CEO of the company that bears her name. She works to create an accessible information and communication technology environment that guarantees equal access for people of all abilities. She was a program director at the GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy. She was the central point of contact and wore many hats for the federal government Section 508 program for 20 years. Her depth of knowledge Her depth of knowledge in this area is outstanding. Helen, we want to welcome you and thank you for being with us today. Helen, by the way, is also a new FGDLA board member, and we're so happy to have her. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. Whoop. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, good afternoon, morning, evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world, I guess. This presentation is going to be a little bit of everything. I'm going to go over a whole bunch of things and give you a whole lot of information. Don't be overwhelmed by it because I have a lot of resources listed at the end of the presentation. Plus, you are more than welcome to contact me if you have any questions or need any more information. My information will also be at the end. We will go for about 50 minutes and then we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, which we will be taking online in the chat box or in the Q&A section. And then we will get to as many of those as we can. So I've got a lot of sections, so, hopefully it won't overwhelm you, but I just wanted to hit on a lot of topics. And all of these topics are related to accessibility in one way or another. So you just need to remember again that this is a Reader's Digest condensed version, and there's a lot of information that you can get on the internet with regard to any of these topics I'm going to be talking about today. Who am I? Carla already told you who I was. I worked for the federal government for 31 years, and I retired from GSA in 2017. And I was a director of Section 508 program in the Office of Government-Wide Policy. I actually was there in 1999 as a temporary employee. I was detailed over to GSA when all of this started. So I have pretty much been in this business since that happened, and it's been a very interesting ride. And Carla told you that I'm the secretary for your organization, and I live in Syracuse, New York right now. That might surprise some people who knew me from the Washington area because I did move. I decided to move home. This is where I was born, and I love snow. That makes me crazy, I know, but I decided to move back up here.
Until you get a call, Helen, from the current administration in Washington wanting you to come back for special items.
Well, I don't think that we sent the president an invitation to the webinar, but who knows who might be looking at it. I do have friends that work in the office of the president, so yes.
Great.
So I'm going to start with some history. Now, I've gone and put in a lot of history because as I was doing this, as I was getting all this information together for this presentation, I really found it fascinating. And so I love to give people lots of information. So again, I said, if you get overwhelmed, you can always go find this online. I do have resources at the end. The history of the disabilities and the ADA, it didn't begin in 1990 or 1998 when it was introduced to Congress or they had a signing ceremony at the White House. Actually, it began a long time ago. And looking back, our approach to people with disabilities has been less than desirable. And I think everybody knows that, and more so my friends that work in the field know that. There's a long history of abuse, discrimination, and lack of compassion and understanding. And that still, unfortunately, to an extent goes on today. So we're going to go back in time to the Greek Empire. And as we all know, probably from school and history lessons, that they were obsessed with a lot of things. They were also obsessed with perfection. And the Roman Empire was similar to the Greek, and they considered people with disabilities to be inferior. And a lot of times they just, if a baby, especially if it was a distinct disability when the baby was born, they would just unfortunately kill the child. With the rise of Christianity, there was a short period of increased sympathy, but not really long, because then they thought that people were possessed by the devil because they were different. And so it increased the fear factor. Then you had the Middle Ages. And of course, that comes with the social oppression. And again, considering it evil, work of the devil. And they were put, by that time, they had institutions. So they put people in institutions, and they were horrible places. I mean, you wouldn't even want an animal to live in these places, but this is what they did with the people because of the fear and anger and everything else that went with it. And then in the Renaissance, King James created the Royal Hospital, which was the first psychiatric hospital. So not that it made it any better for the people who had disabilities, but they were thrown in with the people who had very bad emotional and mental disabilities. And so you had all these people in one place. So it was better, but it wasn't better. Then in the 1700s and 1800s, disabilities became commonplace due to poor working conditions and wars that were going on. You had your wounded soldiers coming back, and you still had really poor medical conditions going on. There weren't doctors that were really trained in anything. So it was leaving a lot of people out. And as it shows here, they became beggars, and, they really still didn't have a good life. There were some training schools available, which made an attempt to train people who had, minor physical and mental disabilities that possibly could be integrated into the community. Then in the 20th century, the Immigration Act, which was labeled the ugly laws, made it illegal to appear in public, if you can't imagine that. That is got to be the most horrific thing. Chicago was the last one to repeal this, and it wasn't until 1974. That's a long time. And that's just kind of, I think it's a shocking revelation. And then, unfortunately, you had the 1930s and the 40s, where you had Hitler and the master race. And there were obviously great issues of abuse for the disabled. And, I'm not going to go into that because it was a very sad part of history, but we all know what went on. And then in 1933, you had Franklin Roosevelt, he had polio, and he tried to hide his disability because he felt that it would not give people a lot of, they wouldn't think he was a good leader, and it wouldn't create a lot of trust in him. If people found out he had a disability, they would not give him as much of their trust as someone who didn't have a disability. So for a long time, he did hide it. Then he finally came out and showed everyone that he did have a disability, and made a lot of strides with disabilities in that era. In 1938, we had the Fair Labor Standards Act, which allowed employers to create lower wages for the disabled, which again, was not a good thing. It just kind of discriminated against people if they had any kind of a disability. And then we had the National Health Foundation. Oh, there we go. I'm moving my little box here. In 1946 to 58, which became an advocate and that was when polio was very prevalent, especially in LA. And the university had rehabilitation programs, and they actually was a newspaper called the Rehabilitation Gazette, published articles about disabilities, actually written by disabled reporters. So again, it was giving people with disabilities a chance to be heard and be seen and allowed to showcase, what they could do and how they could function. 1961 to 1968, we had the ANSI standard, which for the first time we had architectural codes for people with disabilities. So people who had mobile disabilities and could not access facilities and offices and things like that, they slowly started to mandate that anything that was built have these standards incorporated into it, like wider doors and ramps and accessible bathrooms and things like that. And then along came Edward Roberts, who was the first person with a disability admitted to Berkeley in 1962. He was a wheelchair user, he had polio, and he also had an iron lung. And for anybody that can remember back then, those things were the scariest things in the world. I really can't imagine him having an iron lung because they were so huge. When I was a little girl, I used to have nightmares about iron lungs. They're just terrible things. Then you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the National Theater of the Deaf was established. And then you had the ABA, which the ABA and the ADA, people sometimes, they don't know the acronyms, but the ABA is the Architectural Barriers Act, which again builds upon the National Standard Institute, the ANSI, and all federal buildings must be accessible. So that made it mandatory for any federal buildings that were built to be accessible to people with disabilities. Now, this doesn't mean that they were all done that way, but it was a good start. And obviously, as we know, down the road, people got better and better with it. From 1970 to 1979, we had the Urban Mass Transit Act, which required, that things be wheelchair accessible, like buses and possibly taxis, buildings, and things like that, trains, planes, things like that. And WGBH, I think a lot of people know who they are. They're up in Boston. They were one of the first ones in 1971 to be providing closed captioning. And since then, WGBH has become the forefront and the superstar of making sure that television is accessible with the closed captioning, with the audio description, with everything that goes with making things accessible. And then you had the Education of Handicapped Children Act of 1975, the Center for Independent Living founded in Berkeley. And these centers started springing up all over the United States eventually. And it was actually somewhere where a person could go to get demonstrations and take classes and be educated, whether they had a disability or were living with someone with a disability they were taking care of. And they became very prevalent in all the cities around the country. And then we had the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That is where Section 508 comes in. And I will get into that. I've got a section going over all of those statutes and standards. And we also had, I thought this was kind of a chuckle a little bit, we had the first handicap parking sticker. So this was the first time that they realized, well, people who have disabilities can drive cars, and so we should probably make sure that their parking spaces are a little bit closer so that they have access to things and better access. So this is when they came out with that. 1980 to 1989, you had the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act. And this again dealt with people who obviously were in sanitariums and places like that. And it made it mandatory for them to make sure that the facilities were in good enough shape so that people would be, comfortable and have their the comforts that they required and not be put in a position where they were abused. It was also the International Year of Disabled Persons at the UN General Assembly. It was years ago. I was invited to a UN symposium in Rio de Janeiro, and it was for third world countries. And a very good friend of mine who has since passed away, she and I went down there, and I always remember, and my boss had told me that I could represent the General Services Administration, so that's how I put myself in the database. So when we get down there and we get our badges, and every day you had to go through like 3 lines of security and everything, and every day I would be waved through. I didn't have to go through any of the detectors or anything. And my friend had to go through all the security things. And so we were like going, what's going on with this? Well, so we asked someone, and they said, well, since you're representing the US government, you're considered a diplomat. And so you don't have to do these things. So I thought that was kind of an interesting experience. I had never had anything like that happen to me before. We also had the Fair Housing Amendments Act. And in 1990 to 95, we had the ADA, and that was signed into law in 1990. And the ADA basically is for physical disabilities. I do have some slides down the road that we talk about the ADA and Section 508 and what the difference is. The basic difference is ADA, in my mind, ADA is physical and Section 508 is information technology. And we'll get into that in a little while. And then in 2000 and going on, we had the Disability Pride Parade in Chicago in 2004. And that since then, there have been disability pride parades all over the United States. And in March of 2011, the ADA rules took effect, clearly defining a service animal. Up until that point, and even sometimes today, service animals, they bother people. And it's like there are still instances where people are denied entrance. It doesn't matter if it's a service animal or not. I had a friend who was blind, and he had a service animal. And I always remember we wanted to go to this restaurant in Washington. This was years ago. And so we went, took a taxi, took the dog with us, tried to get into the restaurant. They wouldn't let us in because he had the dog. They didn't care if it was a service animal or not. They just weren't going to let us in. So things like that happened back then, and they still happen a little bit now, which is, as I said before, kind of unfortunate. So now I'm going to get into the accessibility standards and regulations. So we have the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which has 4 sections under it that I'm going to talk about. And we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA, which we talked about already. And then we have WCAG. And those are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And I am going to get into that a little bit and explain what that is for people who do and don't know. Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Basically, this came out and it required that anything that the federal government developed, procured, maintained, or used in their federal agencies had to be Section 508 conformant. So it had to conform to the standard, which meant that the standard at that time, the standard was very vague. It laid out some technical requirements, but it did not go into any detail or any depth. So you kind of just were winging it, and we were learning as we went along because I was involved in all this from the beginning. Examples include, your computers, telecommunications, multifunction machines, printers, software, websites, information kiosks, and transaction machines, and electronic documents. All of these were included. And, Section 508 is part of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and it ensures access for people with physical, sensory, or cognitive disabilities. So it doesn't just mean that somebody who is blind or deaf has to be able to have access to information technology. There are many more disabilities that were not recognized even at that time that now are recognized as disabilities where people need to be accommodated. Now, the original rule was issued in 2000. And I was there for that. And then I was involved in the, when we redid the rule and updated it. And that was, the final rule was revised and issued in 2017, 2018, because I think they had to make one update to it. So the new rule is, I'll get into that, and I will get into how that is affecting everything that we're doing today. Now, 255 of the Telecommunications Act was included with the new rule because it covers equipment and customer premises equipment, such as telephones, cell phones, routers, you know, everything that's invisible, it covers. And it covers the protocols and the software integration and the operation of telecommunications functions of all of this equipment. It was included as a section in the revision of Section 508, to my knowledge. And if I do have any friends out there that know any more about the update of 255, please send a question to Carla. 255 was in the process of being updated, but in order to give them sort of a easy way in without having to go through all the long process that we did years and years and years, we put the section in with 508 so that when the time came, they would have an easier time of getting the rule through and getting it, you know, processed and reviewed and all that. Now I'm going to go through these. These are Rehabilitation Act sections, and they do, you know, they are prevalent, and they do, you know, have places in to be included with Section 508 and everything else in the ADA. Section 501 prohibits federal executive agencies, including the post office, from discriminating against qualified individuals. So this is dealing with employment of people with disabilities. So it requires that affirmative action in the hiring and placing of individuals with disabilities is done. And so it just makes people more mindful, and it gives them a standard that they have to comply with in order to make sure that their hiring practices are good. And again, all of this that I'm saying, any one of these can lead to a lawsuit if the person feels that they've been discriminated against. Section 508 applies to contractors and subcontractors who have contracts with the federal government for $10,000 or more. So any contractor that has a contract with the federal government, and we know the federal government employs a lot of contractors and awards a lot of contracts, they have to do the same thing. Make sure that there's no discrimination when hiring. If a person with a disability applies for the job, he's considered just like anybody else that would apply for that job. The other one is Section 504, which is for recipients of federal financial assistance. And that deals with, again, qualified individuals with disabilities in employment and in their programs and activities. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which I talked about before, it prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in several areas. And so this kind of incorporates a lot of things, and it's more physical than the Rehabilitation Act. It is transportation, public accommodations, communications, access to state and local government buildings, programs, and services. And it makes it possible for people to be able to access any kind of government information and buildings. And it also, as it relates to employment in Title I of the ADA, it protects the rights of both employees and job seekers. The ADA also established the requirements for telecommunication services, and it's regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. It also requires closed captioning of federally funded public service announcements. So the big thing that we ran into was, like, for example, if you were going into a federal building and you had to use a kiosk, because eventually, you know, a lot of the federal buildings, including the Smithsonian and places like that, in the entrance, they would have kiosks, or they would have kiosks at the exhibits for people to listen, like when you would get the headphones and the little things when you would walk around in the museum. Well, they started using the kiosks. Well, the kiosks were not accessible to people with disabilities. They didn't have closed captioning. They didn't have any kind of headset or microphone or anything like that that a person with hearing disabilities could use to get the information. And so this was one of the big things that they started working on. When you go into a federal building and you might be deaf or hard of hearing, and a public service announcement comes over the loudspeaker, it should also be broadcast on a screen somewhere in the building where somebody can read it and see what's going on. So I'm
Helen,
gonna,
Helen, I'm
yes.
laughing at that statement because I remember when I was stationed on board my aircraft carrier, the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and you know, there's a lot of jet engine noise, and I could hear the noise even on the bridge, which is where I used to stand my watches, and it used to make we couldn't hear anything after a jet blast. Think about that.
Sure.
So it was kind of hard for the ship to you know, put any broadcast of messaging out to the entire crew. It was really difficult. So I'm glad we're in this era now of all these rules that support people with impairments. So I'm so thankful that we have this, and thank you for bringing this content to us. It's so interesting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is. It's amazing what they can do now. I mean, all the little gadgets that they can come up with, and a lot of the things, you know, and I know, Russ, you and Carla and I were talking about this before the presentation, is that this presentation is just such a Reader's Digest condensed version of all of this information that it could easily be broken down into at least 4 different presentations of, you know, different matters that deal with accessibility. But what I'm giving everyone right now is just, you know, the 40,000 foot version of it. So, and Carla, you had asked me for your students in particular to go over what the difference is between Section 508 and the ADA, because there seems to be some confusion there at times, which I agree, because a lot of times I would have to contend with people sending me emails or asking me questions. Well, you know, it's the ADA, isn't it? It's the same thing as Section 508. I don't have to worry about knowing the difference. Well, that's not true. Section 508, as I said before earlier, it requires that accommodations be made for federal employees and members of the public with disabilities who want to get to government information. And that applies to all kinds of things, you know, from the Department of Education, which supplies, you know, grants and student loans and all kinds of information on education, to the Smithsonian, to the Office of Personnel Management, to the White House, The White House, I must admit, was a hard nut to crack when I was working. This was way back when. And we finally got them on board with their website and the information that they make available to the public. And if you'll notice, more times than not, you will see an interpreter in the corner of the TV set when there's any kind of announcement or anything. Now, they've fallen short, I've noticed, a little bit with the presidential announcements and things like that. They don't have an interpreter all the time. They may have a closed captioning thing, I'm not sure, but we've made great strides in that, and hopefully we'll continue moving forward. The Information and Communications Technology was the new acronym for information technology. And we did that because we wanted to encompass all information technology. Before, we just had kind of a small circuit of it, which dealt with applications and computers, and it didn't expand beyond that, that circle. And so what we tried to do was include that. And of course, as we moved to websites and multimedia and all that stuff and everything, we wanted to make sure it was all included, especially in the new standard. So that's where all of that came in. Now, the ADA, on the other hand, it requires businesses, state and local governments, and nonprofit service providers to make accommodations for disabled public to access the same services as able-bodied patrons. That means movie theaters, digital media, websites, information technology, and anything else you can think of. This includes things like curb cuts. It includes things like, excuse me, I got myself pitched. Curb cuts are the ABA, but the ADA includes physical accommodations. So it could be curb cuts, it could be accessible bathrooms, it could be kiosks, it could be websites. Websites was included in that because it is considered a physical media that people need to access. So I hope that this kind of helps with the descriptions. Carla, do you have anything you might want to add at this point?
No, please go on, Helen.
Okay.
This is wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. And again, this particular area right here that I'm talking about, it can be expanded, and it could be, a short webinar unto itself.
And Helen, just so you know, some of the questions we're answering as you're speaking, and some of the questions we're holding toward the end of the session. And
Okay.
the questions and the comments have been so interesting. And I'll share all these with you as soon as we get a free moment.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. And then this is another slide talking about the difference. The ADA is concerned with preventing all kinds of discrimination. And it's issues, civic access and equal employment opportunity and access to healthcare are also part of the ADA law. It also deals with digital information, as I said before, like kiosks and things like that. Section 508, as I said, has a narrower scope. It applies to accessibility to electronic and information technology. And it's, that term, developed, procured, maintained, or used, that was ingrained in my brain, by the federal government. So anything, and you wouldn't believe the conversations, I will call them, that we would get into with people about what fell into those categories and why do I have to use these categories? I don't understand why this has to be accessible, because it was with a good example I have is with the military. So I'm at a conference and I'm sitting in a session, and there is a colonel. She's the head of a nursing corps for the Army, and she's giving a presentation on their training to train field medics. And she said, I have all these films that the field medics look at, but she said they are fully accessible to anyone with a disability. They're closed captioned and they're audio described, because just because you may not physically be able to be a field medic does not mean that you're not curious about what they do. And she said, our archive holds all these films, and anyone who wants to access one of them can access it. And I thought, wow, that is just wonderful. And those are things that people, they don't think about. They say, well, this guy is blind, so he won't be able to do that. And on the other hand, that's not true. Just because someone has visual disabilities, no matter what they are, does not mean that they're not interested in, learning. Now, this is where audio description comes in. I took an audio description course with Joel Schneider, who is a wonderful, wonderful person. He's the daddy of audio description. And it was an eye-opener. Just even trying to audio describe something is an eye-opener. You just don't realize what a sighted person sees until you have to put it in audio description. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work, because you're looking at it with eyes and the person on the other end is not. And so the description has to relate and relay to them the information, which I thought was it was interesting, to say the least.
Helen, let me just interject on that. Instructional designers and people who design this sort of work, particularly students and advanced degree programs, we do storyboards, and we have to describe what's to be in a picture or the video or whatever, in addition to writing the audio. So it's something that's common in what we do, but probably not as well planned out or thought out as what you're describing as an audio description.
Yeah, but it's probably a good start. Okay, so I'm getting a little behind here. I know I don't have a whole lot of time left, so I want to get through some more main sections. So anyway, the main difference is that Section 508 is for federal agencies, and the ADA is for anyone else that has to do with accessibility. The Web Accessibility Initiative and the W3C, they created web content accessibility guidelines, and they turned 20 years old in May of 2019. So they had this is very technical, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but I do have all the links in here if people, want to have some good reading and something that's guaranteed to put you to sleep in 10 minutes. So the guidelines is a set of standards and best practices for creating accessible digital content. Okay, so it has 3 levels of accessibility conformance. Again, this is all in their standards if you want to look them up. And it's required for public-facing contents, online shops and services, and educational materials and government websites. The U.S. Access Board, these are the guys that are involved with all of these, the ADA, Section 508, and all of the regulations that are concerned with giving people with disabilities access to everything, from lakes to swimming pools, to airplanes, to trains, to buses, to anything. These guys have a really good site, and Section 508, 255, and all of the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA and everything are on their site if you want more information on this. Legal update. All people have the right to equal treatment and shouldn't experience discrimination because they happen to have a disability. Many laws in the US support this right. If you violate one of these laws, then you can find yourself at the defensive end of a lawsuit, which, yes, that happens quite a bit. This is a lawsuit that was from March 2020, and it was a settlement between Irving Berryhill and the District Court of California for kiosks to be made accessible, Braille, audio instructions, headphone jack, privacy safeguards, training personnel, and testing for functionality. So this was, I don't know any details monetary wise, if there was. A lot of these don't have monetary settlements. There are other settlements that come out of them, but this was just an example of one. And this website, if you want some good information on the legal part of accessibility, they have monthly updates. And this is a monthly update. 248 accessibility lawsuits were filed in the month of March. And then it goes down on to break them down. And unfortunately, I'm embarrassed to say that 70% were filed in New York. So, and out of them, 141 specifically cited WCAG, and then, or the lack of, and then they had 22 cited Section 508 and 8 don't cite anything. Whoops. So here's kind of a breakdown. So this is, by 5 states: New York, California, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois. You can see New York was the most, with California next, then Florida, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. And these are the industries that were targeted the most. So you can see consumer goods, apparel, food products, leisure products, and finance. Most of these were probably websites and online shopping and things like that that people couldn't do. The European Union, which is all of Europe, most of Europe, I should say, they have all of their public sector websites must conform by last year. Whether that was done, I don't know. We collaborated a lot with them in the US, and they're continuing to a discussion as to whether it should become an ISO standard, which is an international standard. And Switzerland is also, and these are just two of the most prominent entities, countries that are working on accessibility. Most of Europe and Scandinavia are doing really good jobs. I have friends who have companies there. Famous people with disabilities. This just blew my mind away. There's all kinds of people who have disabilities. I just was amazed. I don't know, on the left-hand bottom here, I don't know if anyone is familiar with Itzhak Perlman. I love Itzhak Perlman. I have listened to him since I was very young, and he is the most exceptional violinist. He had polio. Of course, we all know Stevie Wonder, and we all know Stephen Hawkins, and Einstein and Tom Cruise. This is a list of people, and I'm not going to dwell on a lot of these. You can, this will be available if you want a copy of it. But it's amazing how many people had things like dyslexia, autism, ADHD, cerebral palsy, dysgraphia, stuttering. Our own president is a stutterer, and he has self-taught himself not to stutter. Winston Churchill was a stutterer, deaf, blind, deaf, and mute. Of course, Helen Keller, she was the poster person for a lot of this. Attention deficit, Albert Einstein. I mean, the man was a genius, but he couldn't sit still for 3 minutes. Learning disability, Winston Churchill. And unfortunately, Lou Gehrig's disease, Stephen Hawking, who we all miss very much. Usability and accessibility. Usability and accessibility go hand in hand. And usability is how easy things are to use. I've sat on usability tests before, and it's amazing. If the programmers develop something and then they put it in front of the audience that's going to use it, most people go, what? This isn't what I want. This isn't what I told you I needed. So communication is really good. Usability testing is a must, because you will be shocked if you ever sat in a usability test at the mind of a programmer versus the mind of a regular person. Accessibility in the sense considered here refers to the design of the products and devices, okay? So can assistive technology be connected to it and things like that? So I'm gonna press on because I know I'm running out of time here. Education and accessibility. The ADA was first passed in 1990 and refreshed in 2008. Applies to public K through 12, private K through 12, private and public colleges and universities. Requires that schools must provide accommodations for students with disabilities. Under Title II and Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, both public and private colleges and universities must make their programs accessible to students with disabilities. This includes accommodations for extracurricular activities, as well as any in-class requirements. And it's surprising how much that doesn't happen. Hopefully it's gotten better and getting better, but it was a struggle at first. We dealt with a lot of universities that had these problems.
When I'm creating courses, we have committees, people who are experts in this, and they review all of the material that we provide in writing a course, and then come back to us and tell us what to do, what not to do, how to fix it.
Yep, that's good. So to meet these requirements, they must provide to stable students with lots of things: fair access to buildings, including dorms and things like that, aids and services for effective communication, sign language interpreters, and Braille formats if needed, modified policies and procedures such as testing accommodations and access to school facilities for service animals, It's surprising how simple it is to do a test, how many people don't do it, and then they really get upset when it hits them in the face, when they could have taken 5 minutes to do this versus 4 hours to explain why they didn't do it and how they're going to fix it. Higher education, I have a real world example of a Ivy League university. They failed to provide closed captioning for their online lectures, courses, podcasts, and other educational materials. They reached a settlement totaling more than 1.5 million, and they're taking steps to make sure that these platforms are accessible to people with disabilities.
Helen, boy, I sure am glad we're using live transcription today. I'd hate to be wrapped up in something like that.
That's very true. That's very true. Creating accessible online training avoids misunderstandings, cognitive overload, and other barriers, effective training and improved training outcomes. It uses plain language. Plain language, that was like pulling teeth to get people to use plain language. It's very interesting, and plain language is not all that difficult, so that learners can understand. Even myself, I understand more if it's in plain language than if it's got all these words in it. I don't know what they mean. Accessible design is a must. That's where WCAG comes in. WCAG is has an acronym: POUR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Each one of these is a must when you are developing online training. And again, all of WCAG is in plain language. It's really easy to understand. Even I can understand it. I'm not a programmer, but I can understand what they're saying and what they want the programmers to do. Assistive technology. It's any piece of equipment, software program, or product system used by a person with a disability to be able to access different things. And I'm just kind of going to go a little bit fast through this. All kinds of assistive technology: low-tech, high-tech hardware, computer software, inclusive or specialized, and much, much more. These are some examples. These are large font keyboards, which I love, love, love. I have had one for years. They are wonderful. Zoom text, to bring things closer. A mouth pointer. This gentleman has cerebral palsy, can't use his hands, so he has a mouth pointer that he can use on the screen. Rollerball mice. They are always good for people who have dexterity problems. Dragon Naturally Speaking. So I could talk and it will write whatever I want and put it into a document and email it to somebody. Assisted listening devices, which people with hearing problems or hearing aids use in a meeting so that they can hear what's going on. They're usually into an electronic system, and then it broadcasts back. So you have a receiver and a sender. Braille input devices. These need to be able to interact with computers. Finger sticks for people who don't have the dexterity in their fingers to use a keyboard. They can use the finger stick to push the keys. These are some resources. I know there's probably a lot more, but these are the ones I thought were the most important. So if anyone wants these, they're more than welcome. I will be happy to send you a copy of the presentation, or we may post it online. This is who I am again. And that my email at the bottom, as you can see, I have cats. And if you have any questions or need anything, regardless of what it is, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Russ, do we have time to do some questions?
I think so, Carla, so many of them, but the most burning and the most often asked question is, can you please explain where the recording will be for this session, and also where can we obtain, or how can we obtain slides from your presentation, Helen?
And Carla, I know we had talked about that. Shirley, if you want to, you can email me at siamesers@aol.com, and I will be more than happy to send you the slides. Carla, we had discussed some things. I don't know if we were planning on posting it on the website or.
Yes, we'll post it on the website, and if anybody wants to contact us, we'll be glad to send them anything. So
Can you give that website address out? Can you spell it out?
sure, it's FGDLA.us. And so all of the previous, FGDLA, Federal Government Distance Learning Association.us, as in United States.
Okay.
And also, Helen, there's one person that I am going to send the complete transcript to via email. So that was a special request that came in, and I'll take action on that item. May I ask this? And then as a first question that came in from an anonymous attendee. Prior to 1990, before the ADA was signed into law, were there efforts to meet compliance needs by private sector?
I don't take my word at this, but not that I know of, because I know that the private sector was a little bit harder to get on board because all of the laws and standards were federally enacted. And so there was a period of time when they didn't feel that they were regarded to them. They didn't feel that they applied to them. And so that was part of why the ADA, put those sections in there that dealt with contractors specifically, and contractors that worked with the federal government. So they've come a long way. But yes, I can understand what you're saying. Back then, yeah, they really didn't think it applied to them.
Okay, thank you for that, Helen. Another one is there a list of either podcasts or videos, something that helps an individual or a company in creating 508 compliant apps, like mobility apps and websites and desktop? Is there some particular list or where to go to find out specific information?
You can go to section508.gov, all one word, section508.gov. And that website has development instructions, it has training, it has information on what's going on all over the federal government. Another place you might check also is, trying to think of, Homeland Security. The Department of DHS.gov. DHS.gov does the trusted tester certification. The trusted tester certification is a program that's used throughout the federal government to test applications for accessibility. But I think they also have other information on there that would give you information on creating applications and things like that.
Okay, Helen. Well, let me ask you this, as the last question, because I'm watching the time here. Are state governments required to adhere to federal requirements, particularly if federal funds support the work?
Anything that's funded by the federal government, they are mandated under Section 508 to adhere to those statutes. Now, most states, and hopefully all of them by now, have created their own accessibility requirements. Canada, Australia also, pretty much all 50 states have created their own accessibility criteria and requirements. If you search your state under accessibility laws and regulations, you should come up with not only procurement plus programming and websites and all that should be. But again, Section 508, or not Section 508 actually, but the ADA kind of covers a lot of that, and it applies to everybody in the United States anyway.
Helen, last question. Sarah has such a good question. Do you believe that more needs to be done? If so, how do you view the future of accessibility?
Oh, yikes. Oh, there's always more to be done. There's always more to be done. I think we have made great strides. What I would like to see is for the president to continue. He is developing a new accessibility group out of the White House. And I would like to really see him continue to do that and make it more on the forefront. So more people are engaged and involved. Now, there are a lot of institutions, National Federation of the Blind and all kinds of organizations out there that are actively involved and have made great strides. Just since I've been in the arena for the last, it's been 20 plus years, the difference is amazing, but yes, there's still a long way to go.
Thank you, Helen. A lot of good questions here, and we'll cover these when we get together momentarily. I suggest that we just pass the floor back to Carla for some closing words, please.
Okay, thank you so much. And we want to thank you for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. We had a great crowd today, a lot of Zoom people, and we were happy to have you all and UNICEF. Helen, thank you so much for being with us today. What a fabulous bunch of information. I think we should do part 2 and really
Thank you.
down on things. I'm serious because it's so much information and we need to tap into it now that you're so beautifully empowered. So we want to thank Helen, we want to thank Russ, and we want to thank Zoom. It's been a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us, and that concludes the webinar. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.